David always wondered why the floor in his hallway was colder than in the rest of the house. One day, while fixing a leaky faucet, he noticed a loose floorboard and decided to investigate. To his surprise, he found a hidden room under his hall that looked like nothing had been done to it for years. David's curiosity got the better of him, and he descended the stairs, ready to explore. David slowly descended the stairs, his heart pounding with every step he took. As he reached the bottom, he shone his light around the room and was amazed by what he saw. The room was small and dusty, filled with old furniture covered in cobwebs. But there was something very odd about this room. A layer of dust covered the room. Well, almost, because at some spots, the dust was brushed away. At first, David thought mice or rats could have done that. But then he started to hear noises coming from upstairs. There was someone in his hall. David rushed to the stairs, but it was too late. David saw a shadowy figure move through his hall, and they quickly placed the floorboards back on David's hall floor, trapping him in the dusty, dark room underground. This did not look good. But why was there a secret room underneath David's hall? Who trapped him in there? And will he get out? David had always felt a strange chill beneath his feet whenever he entered the hall of his small cottage. The floors of the other rooms felt warm and comforting, but in the hall, his toes were always met with a cold and clammy sensation. But he could never find out why. For years, he had assumed that it was just a quirk of the old house, but it still bothered him. One day, while washing his dishes, David heard a faint creaking noise coming from the ground. He stopped what he was doing and listened, trying to locate the source of the sound. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping that seemed to be coming from underneath his feet. He walked around the hall, tapping on the floor with his foot, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. As he walked towards the sink, the sound grew louder, and he realized it was coming from the floorboards. David knelt down and examined the tiles around the sink, searching for any signs of damage or weakness. He quickly felt a wet spot and immediately knew what was going on. His faucet was leaking, and the sound was coming from the water dripping down. There was one problem, though. David had absolutely no experience in plumbing. So, he called a plumbing service, but they had bad news for him. The soonest they could arrive was in 2 days. David had no time to wait for 2 days. He had to fix the leaking sink as soon as possible. Otherwise, his floorboards would be ruined. So he decided to fix it on his own. What could go wrong, he thought. But little did he know he was about to stumble upon something he never even dared to think about. He grabbed everything he had and got to work, turning off the water and following the pipes. But he soon stumbled upon a problem. While he walked around his hall, he noticed one problem after another. At first, he realized the water pipes ran deep down underneath his house. And after that, he noticed a loose floorboard. He stepped onto the board a few times and it would creak and slightly lift up each time. He stepped on it a few times to loosen it up a little more and to think about what he should do with it. He was hesitant to open it, as he didn't want to ruin his floors. He bent down and tried to peek under it without having to open it, but that didn't work. David decided to investigate the loose floorboard further. He knelt down and tried to pry it open with his fingers. But that didn't seem to work, so he tried it with a screwdriver. He knelt down and pried the loose board off, only to find that there was something beneath it that wasn't pipes or insulation. David peered underneath his floorboards and saw a set of stairs leading down into darkness. His heart began to race with excitement and fear as he realized that he had discovered a hidden room under his hall. His mind raced with different scenarios as he decided on what to do next. There had been no information about a hidden room when he bought the house years ago. He had looked at the ground plan before buying the place, and there was nothing like this on there. Otherwise, he would have definitely remembered it. David stared at the stairs and suddenly felt very curious. After thinking for a few minutes, David grabbed a flashlight and carefully descended the stairs. his curiosity getting the better of him. With every step, it got darker and darker. As he reached the bottom, he shone his light around the pitch-black room and was amazed by what he saw. The room was small and dusty, filled with old furniture covered in cobwebs. A layer of dust covered everything, indicating that it hadn't been touched in years, or so he thought. Fear and curiosity battled within him, but his curiosity ultimately won out. David took a deep breath and investigated further. He slowly shuffled around the room, scared to step on something he rather not step on. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he shone his flashlight carefully around the room. Sometimes he paused and looked at the details of the left-behind furniture. Who had put this all in here? As he explored the room further, David noticed something strange. As he looked around the room, he noticed not everything was covered in dust. At first, he thought maybe mice or rats had brushed the dust away. But among the little animal paw prints, he also noticed marks he couldn't quite place. The markings were way too big to come from a rodent. They almost looked human-like, with 5 little toes. That can't be right, David thought. He was sure he would have noticed someone coming in and out of his hall. But it wasn't entirely impossible. What the heck was going on here? David's heart began to race as he realized he might not be alone. There might have been someone else living in this secret room all along. He quickly scanned the room, looking for any signs of movement or life. But everything was still and quiet, except for the sound of his own breathing. Suddenly, David felt something brush against his hair. He shone the light above him and saw a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. He quickly searched for the light switch and turned it on. The light was dim, but just enough for David to make his way around the room without his flashlight. There was a cot in one corner, a pile of blankets in another, and a small table with a few scattered items. David also noticed a stack of books and a half-eaten sandwich. Someone had been living down here, and it was clear that they weren't a mere intruder. This was unbelievable. David stayed downstairs for a few more minutes to look around. He was truly amazed and appalled by what he had found. Suddenly, he heard the floorboards upstairs creak. He looked up the stairs and saw a shadowy figure moving around. But just as he was about to run up the stairs, something happened. The shadowy figure upstairs quickly placed the floorboards back, trapping David in the dusty room downstairs. David was in complete shock. How will he get out of this room? He felt a wave of panic rush over him, and he had to try his best to stay calm, but it wasn't looking good for him. David, who was slightly claustrophobic, felt his heart race in his chest. It almost felt like he couldn't breathe anymore, but he knew it was in his head. He sat down on the ground with his head between his legs and started his breathing techniques. This way, he could calm himself down. He shouted to be freed, but no one heard him. Then, survival mode kicked in. David figured there had to be a way out. If someone had been living here undetected for so long, the hall floor couldn't be the only way in and out, could it? So, he started searching. He looked underneath the dusty rugs, behind the couch, and in every corner. But there didn't seem to be a way out. Then, he decided to look in the cabinets. And to his surprise, one of the cabinets concealed the entrance of a very long tunnel. David peeked inside, and he could feel a breeze running through. This was probably the reason why his feet were always cold. There was a constant flow of air rushing through his floorboards. By now, the tunnel seemed to be his only way out of this dark room. And as his claustrophobia was slowly kicking in, he knew he had to hurry. David took a deep breath in and turned on his flashlight. Then he started to make his way through the small and narrow tunnel. He couldn't walk, as the tunnel was too small, but he could crawl through it on his hands and knees. The soil was cold and moist, but it didn't stop David from crawling out. His heart was pounding in his chest as he crawled through the long and narrow tunnel. His mind raced with questions. How long had someone been living underneath his house? Did this person only stay downstairs? Or would this person sneak around in his home as well? Chills ran down his spine.
Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day. Now, back to the story.
The thought of someone living inside his house at the same time as him, without ever being seen, scared the shit out of David. Then, finally, he saw a light at the end of the tunnel. He had made it out, but had no idea where he was. The entrance of the tunnel was out in the open, but not for long. Before returning to his house, David made sure no one could go in or out of the tunnel anymore. This way, he trapped the person inside his house without him knowing. David hoped the person would flee through the tunnel, not realizing there was no way out. But it wasn't that easy. First, David had to find his way back to his house. He thought it couldn't be that far, as the tunnel wasn't super long. He walked along what he thought was the tunnel and eventually saw his house through the dense trees. He stopped for a second and saw movement inside his living room. Someone was inside his house. David thought about what he should do next. His home was somewhat far from any police station, so it would take a long time for them to get there, and he didn't want to wait outside in the cold for so long. So he decided to take matters into his own hands. He squatted down behind a bush and waited until the person inside his house was no longer in front of the window. He thought of a plan to capture the mystery intruder, but he wasn't in a great position. He wasn't the fittest man on the planet and had never gotten into a fight before. Then it was time. David sneaked toward his house, trying not to be seen by the person inside. It was a nerve-wracking situation to be in, as he had no idea what the intentions of the person were. Was it just someone who sought a place to crash? Or was it someone with an aggressive or even criminal background? It could easily go both ways, so David had to be prepared. He looked around for a weapon of some sort and found a big stick. With the stick in his hand, he sneaked toward the front door. Luckily for him, the door was unlocked. Then, he carefully creaked open the door and looked inside his house. The hallway was empty, but he saw muddy footprints covering his floor. They looked to be from a barefooted man, which confused David. Why would someone walk around without shoes on? But he didn't dwell on that thought for long, as he suddenly heard loud noises coming from his hall. David carefully walked through his hallway toward his hall. He tried his best not to be heard, but his wooden floorboards creaked as he stepped on them. He stopped to listen if the intruder might have heard him. But luckily for him, the intruder was too busy with other things to notice David creeping around. He was now almost at his hall door. Not long until he would stand face to face with the intruder. His heart raced as he stepped closer and closer. As he peeked inside the hall, he saw the intruder standing with his back toward David. He was making himself a sandwich with David's freshly bought bread. This almost drove David over the edge, but he managed to get a hold of his emotions. He took a deep breath and cleared his throat. The intruder froze, probably scared to move. "Who are you? And what are you doing in my hall?" David sternly asked. I can explain." "Turn around," David said, but the intruder didn't move. "Turn around," he yelled again. But still no movement. David lowered the stick, which he was still holding in his hands, and loosened up his posture. He got a feeling the intruder wasn't as dangerous as he thought, but he was wrong. It was as if the intruder could sense David had lowered his stick, because as soon as he did, the intruder took a run for it. He spun around and sped past David. David, who didn't expect this at all, was too slow and couldn't grab the intruder as he barged past him. But he wouldn't let him get away with this so easily. David immediately sprinted past the intruder, but he had no idea where he had gone. Did he run outside, or did he hide somewhere inside his house? David stood in the doorway and looked out of his front door. He tried to see if there was movement between the trees, but he saw nothing. He looked for a few more minutes and thought he saw something moving behind the trees. "Yeah, you better run and never come back," he yelled at what he thought was the man. He felt relieved and glad he could scare the man away without a fight. So, he confidently headed back inside. Convinced he had scared away the intruder, David closed the door and locked it behind him. He felt sure no one would find a way into his house again, as he had closed up the entrance of the tunnel. But little did he know, the intruder didn't run out of his house at all. David walked over to his living room to see what the intruder had done when he was alone in the house. The couch was dirty and the TV was on. Footprints covered his floor, making it easy to track where the intruder had walked. Luckily, he saw no footprints leading up the stairs. As David wanted to walk back to his hall, he noticed the door was shut. He frowned as he thought he had left the door open on his way out. Suddenly, he realized the intruder could still be inside his house. He quietly walked over to the door and put his ear against it to listen. And to his shock, he heard a sound coming from the hall. It sounded like something opening and closing. David grabbed his stick tightly in his hands, counted down from 3, swung the door open, and jumped inside his hall. But no one was there. Strange, David thought. He was sure he had heard noises from inside this room. He checked behind the counter and in some of the cabinets, but the room was really empty. Then he froze and thought, maybe the intruder climbed through the window? He checked, but the window was locked. Strange, he thought. But he listened again and heard the sound coming from beneath him. Could the intruder have gone downstairs again? He wouldn't be that stupid, right? David chuckled as he realized he had trapped the intruder downstairs without even trying. He quickly placed a heavy chair on the hatch and called the police. He explained to the police what had happened, and they told him to sit tight and wait. But that wasn't in David's character. He wondered who it was, living underneath his house, and he had no patience. The police could easily take about an hour to arrive, which was way too long for David to wait. So he ran back to the entrance of the tunnel and slipped inside. He crawled through the tunnel and quickly reached the secret room. The intruder was clearly inside, as David heard him mumbling to himself. David swung open the cabinet door and jumped out of the tunnel, scaring the intruder. The intruder yelled and begged David not to hurt him. He sounded really scared, and David almost felt sorry for him. He wanted to scare him, but not to such an extent. The intruder stood in front of him with his hands up in the air. "Please don't shoot me, sir!" he yelled. Did he think David was the police? There was nowhere to go, and the intruder realized that. He looked at David and just sat down on the floor without saying a word. David, who could now clearly see what the intruder looked like, noticed how defeated he looked. The man was dirty, barefooted, and wore ripped-up clothing. David asked the man why he lived there and how he even discovered this place, and his response was truly shocking. The man told David he had been wandering around the forest, looking for a place to sleep. Unfortunately, he was homeless, and it was raining, so he searched for a dry spot. That's when he noticed it. The tunnel. It was covered in leaves and branches, almost impossible to spot. At first, the homeless man thought it was a hollow tree, so he sat near the entrance for a while. But after a while, he noticed how long the tree had to be, so he decided to crawl a bit further. The tunnel. He crawled through and stumbled upon this room. For the homeless man, it was like a sign from above. And since then, he had been living there. It was dry and safe, unlike the streets, which David could understand. A few minutes later, the police arrived, and they arrested the man for trespassing. A few minutes later, David could hear the sirens coming closer. The man looked up with fear in his eyes. He was scared to be hurt by the police, but David was able to calm him down. He assured the man the police wouldn't hurt him, and that he at least had a place to sleep for tonight. David left the homeless man to guide the police in his direction. He waited by the entrance of the tunnel and waved to the police to come in his direction. He told the police that the man was confused and harmless, so they had no reason to be aggressive toward him. Within seconds, the secret room was swarmed with police officers. They inspected the room and took the homeless man into custody. They asked David if he wanted to press charges, but David didn't want to cause the man more trouble. He just wanted him to get the help he needed. A few hours later, David was alone again. He stood in his secret room and looked around. He sighed and decided to crawl out through the tunnel so he could close it up again. He stacked a few loose rocks on top of each other and made a makeshift wall. "That'll do for now," he thought. David was stunned by what had happened, but he knew he didn't want to leave the room untouched. Now that he knew what was beneath his haul, he wanted to make the best of it, and he knew exactly what he was going to do. Something he had always dreamed of, but never knew could be possible. He filled the tunnel with sand from the beginning of his secret room until the entrance. No one could ever come in that way ever again. After that, he spent his days cleaning out the secret room and turning it into something he had always wanted: his very own man cave. He had always dreamt of owning a man cave and had many ideas for it. He eventually chose to carpet the floors, renew the stairs, and even install a huge flat-screen TV. He had no wife to get away from yet, but he knew he would spend a lot of time inside this new room. He also renewed the hatch so it was easier to open. As for the homeless man, David stayed in contact with him to ensure he was treated fairly, and he arranged for him to stay at a homeless shelter. The man was grateful for David's mercy and vowed to better himself. The homeless man, named Greg, eventually got a job and saved enough money to rent his own place. He never forgot about David and planned to pay him back someday. And that was exactly what he did. He saved enough money to give to David for the trouble he had caused. David initially didn't want to accept the money, but Greg insisted. He felt it was the only right thing to do, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. David eventually accepted the money and donated part of it to the homeless shelter Greg stayed in before. The rest of the money he used for his man cave. No one ever broke into David's house again, and he eventually started to feel safe again. He never forgot about the man living underneath his house without him knowing, and was grateful for the things that came from it. Without Greg, David would have never had his man cave.